Hello, today I'm joined by Chris Lipp from Bristol Business School, and we're going to be talking about epistemology, particularly his chosen epistemology, which is critical realism. I wonder if you could summarize critical realism for us.
Sure. I think what's important to know about critical realism is that it's unique in that it is rooted in a realist ontology and a subjective epistemology. So it agrees. The realist ontology implies that it agrees that there's a reality that is independent of us.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the subjective epistemology implies that our knowledge of it is necessarily sort of subjective or dependent on the person and on their sort of background. So what it actually means is that there is not a direct link between the object, the thing that we perceive, and our understanding of it. It's an indirect link between those two things that goes via the perception or the representation. So essentially, there is something independent of us. It is filtered by our limited sort of ability to perceive it. And it's the representation of it that we see as real.
Okay, so it's it feels like you've got an extreme relativist ontology would be everything socially constructed. An
Yes.
extreme realist ontology is everything's empirical, it's out there to be found. And you're somewhere in the middle, which is there are things out there to be found, but your perception shapes them.
Yes, your perception shapes them in your own mind.
Yeah.
Obviously not. It doesn't shape them because they're independent and they exist. And what's important as well is that it really focuses on the social reality. So that's where it becomes very complex, because we understand that the social reality is obviously not independent of people, of humans, and it implies a lot of things. It implies concepts that are interpretable. It implies values that are obviously relative as well to the people or even the period in which they are discussed. It implies events and facts that are laden of those values. So yeah, it's very complex in that sense.
Okay, so it sort of draws on other epistemologies, objectivism and subjectivism.
Yes.
What about constructionist epistemologies? How does it fit there with that?
The constructionist sort of epistemologies see sort of the world based on the meaning, the confluence of meanings that we attribute to things. So they are essentially, the reality is therefore built by those subjective meanings that we perceive.
So if in constructionism the perception of the object is from multiple meanings, how is that different to critical realism?
It's not in that sense, because the epistemology is similar. It's a subjective epistemology, and it builds exactly on the same principles. But the idea of some sort of philosophical perspectives that are based on subjective epistemologies tend to be as well that there is a subject or sort of a not an independent reality beyond that. And that is the very important difference between critical realism and other epistemologies.
So it's the ontological route that the epistemology is based on. So
Yes.
sorry, a constructionist would take a more relativist ontological position than a critical realist.
Yes, and what the theory or philosophical perspectives that are based on relativist ontologies tend to do is assume a certain way the world needs to be, rather than a description of the world as it is. And obviously, well, what I'm saying here is they would criticize it a lot, but I think what I thought was attractive about the critical realist position is the absence of this confluence of the is versus ought to be positions. It clearly says there are things that are, and it also acknowledges that what we know of social reality is based on historical facts that are interpreted, that are, you know, riddled with power relationships and things like that. But it does make this quite clear, the difference between those, and it's quite careful about moral. It's quite cautious about sort of the moral attribution of what's good and what's not good, because all this essentially it implies the pluralism of these views. So when you analyze a topic, you have to essentially look at different perspectives of it, but also realize that that thing that you're analyzing might be independently there.
Who are the main authors that you'd recommend if somebody's interested in critical realism from maybe the pure theoretical basis? Who are your key touchstones in that area?
There's well, one of the issues with critical realism is that it's really a meta theoretical position, and it's very difficult to find the one book or the one author that will tell you everything about critical realism. And most importantly, all of them sort of disagree on tiny elements. And all of them focus on different points of critical realism as well. I think there are obvious authors and books that you have to read. One of them is Andrew Sayers' book on the social reality from, I think it's 1992, but it was republished in 2000. And one of the important points of Sayers is, among many others, is the description of the ontology of critical realism, which he sees as it's stratified, emergent, and generative. So what that implies is, well, it's stratified because there is different layers of levels of understanding that you can have. So you can look at one, for example, a business, which is my area. You could look at it from the really a macroeconomic view, where it's literally just the business itself. One business is just a point among many, a number among many. Or you could look at all the way down to the micro sort of atomic level and look at all the interactions between atoms of, you know, that actually create the people who are then interacting with each other. And there's all these levels in between. It's emergent because, in the sense that all these levels have different properties or imply different properties. So if you look at a startup business, it has the possibility to raise funding or raise finance, which is not possible for one of the individuals or one of the things that are centrally constructing that startup. And yeah, and the last point was generative. which essentially implies that there's the entities that build those systems generate different sort of properties. And so the essentially this this view by Sayer, if you look at the emergent properties that he discusses, you also have to look at Elder-Vass, and Elder-Vass discussed emergent properties and other elements that are really essential to critical realism. You should also read Margaret Archer's books on where she focuses on reflexivity and morphogenesis, which are all aspects that are, again, kind of that sort of build this position. One of my favorite books, however, is from Mingers in 2014, because it clarifies the link between systems thinking and critical realism, and it's extremely well structured. So not only is it built on many of these authors that provided a lot of different concepts that build together this view, but also it's recent. So it actually looks at the most recent and important things. Now, the other problem with critical realism is that because it's such a sort of meta-theoretical view, it doesn't actually tell us much about what we need to do as researchers. And some have attempted to build upon the critical realist view to draw how we should do research. And one of the books that I would recommend for that is Danermark and her colleagues from 2002. I think it's Understanding Society. Essentially, it's a very good book on how to do research, but it should be seen as a guideline rather than, well, it shouldn't be seen as a this is how you have to do it, because essentially critical realism implies methodological pragmatism, which means essentially that you have to decide on the method you use according to the problem you're trying to solve. So all this together obviously creates a very complex position, but that makes it also as well interesting. And I think in the end, there's three sort of main things that should influence your choice of position, of meta-theoretical position. First of all is the understanding of them. So you have to have there's one way to do it is just having a menu of all the positions and choosing one. It's one way to do it. I wouldn't say it's the best way to do it. The second one is to address essentially the theory or the research that has been done in the area you're looking at. So looking at the area, looking at the problem you're trying to solve. How has it been researched before? What could another position actually contribute, and in what way could it contribute? And how could it be useful in solving a problem that might have not been solved so far? And the third is really your own sort of personal position. I mean, what do you believe in? What do you think? And then see how the position fits to your views. And I think, well, I did a bit of all the three.
So I mean, this comes back to the idea that choice of ontology, epistemology, and even theoretical grounding is almost a political process, heavily influenced by your supervisors, others in the field. Critical realism, I would say, is not used much, and I know not used so much in your area that you're particularly interested, researching innovation, new business startups. Just briefly to close, why is that? And why did you choose to go this way?
Well, there's the two sort of main areas that are, or main theoretical perspectives that are used in entrepreneurship. although the one is the very dominant positivist position, and the other one is obviously the sort of interpretivist aspect or side. And my specific question was looking at how small businesses grow and how they can be supported in that growth. And reading through all the research that's been done in that area, that's heavily dominant on positivism, I couldn't find something that actually was satisfactory. There was no, well, there's a view of firm growth that looks at the stages of growth, and it's very deterministic and linear. But the reality of it is something very different. So this positivistic view didn't actually help in answering the question of essentially how do firms grow. So I decided to choose critical realism in that sense, because it addresses, or it helps to understand the fact that there is, again, looking back at the main construct of this position, the fact that we have representations of things. It's the same with a business. Essentially, a business is in everybody's mind is represented in very different ways, be it by the product it sells or by how much it generates taxes for a country, or for how much investment it returns, and these perceptions actually create sort of forces that push or pull the business in different direction. Well, at least that's how I've started to understand it. I think the reason why critical realism is not adopted that much is, first of all, it's much more recent than the other positions. And I would say it's complex. I mean, that's one of the things. But the main, I think the important thing, and it's mentioned in Minger's 2014, is the fact that it doesn't really create any certainty, and it's not made to do that, because it understands that every situation that we face is unique, and therefore there are structural forces that affect all events, all situations, and those forces may or may not be manifested in certain situations. And therefore, every position is unique, and you cannot predict things. And that I think is a strong obstacle to its adoption, because people want to know what's going to happen in the future.
The desire for certainty.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's one of the main barriers to more people adopting critical realism?
The way I see it is that we are taught in a sort of dichotomic way. So it's either one side or the other. It's either a realist ontology or relativist ontology. It's either subjective or objective epistemology. And it's easy to understand in this way. And it's essentially based on how it's been done in the past. But perhaps what we should look into is where are the gray areas, because nothing is just one extreme or the other. And I think it's perhaps the problem of teaching philosophy of science is actually conveying this complexity and providing the options to those who actually will use them.
Because one of the things I find is a lot of students back away from this area anyway, because the words are unpleasant. Ontology, epistemology, these aren't naturally engaging words, but they do, they explain succinctly what we're trying to do, which is how do you see the world, how do you understand the world, and therefore what can you know about the world.
Yes, it's difficult to understand, and I'm not. I think it took me a few months as well to just read into it, and every time I discuss it with any, any professor, any expert in these areas, it's always shaking my own foundations and understandings. But I think that's part of it as well. Is going through these. The issue probably is that we're asked to be experts in our areas, which in my case is entrepreneurship, innovation. But at the same time, we're asked to be as knowledgeable about philosophy of science, research methods and methodologies. And there's just so much you can read within the time of a PhD. And perhaps that's one of the issues. At some point, we have to be experts in too many different things.
It's very true. And actually, I think even as you get more senior in your career, these areas still haunt us.
Okay, well, that's not reassuring.
It's all part of learning. It's why we do it. Excellent. Well, I think that's hopefully given those listening some insight into critical realism, maybe help them choose that path to develop the research and see it's an opportunity of a new lens, a new way of thinking about the subject area.
I hope it has. I think it's an adventure to go into this, and it's a very interesting research area in general.
Super. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.